Good morning. It's good to see all of you here this morning in the house of the Lord. It's good to be here. Amen. A lot of visitors with us this morning. You honor us by choosing to worship God with us. We know you had other choices, but you honor us this day and you encourage us. We sort of desire that encouragement. Anytime you have an opportunity, we'd like for you to come back. You'd honor us by choosing to spend some time with us in worship, in Bible study, or in fellowship. We've been doing a series of lessons on the Sermon on the Mount. And John and I, we meet each week and we do a lot of talk and discussing and sharing and planning. And so some time ago, we decided to do the Sermon on the Mount. Understanding that these three chapters in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, are probably the longest text we have of Jesus' direct teaching, his sermon, if you will. And so we've decided to try as much as we can just to remain real faithful to the text and just present the text as it is. And so this morning's lesson, both of us are going to do it because we both feel like we have a few things to say about it. So I'm just going to read the text and try to help us understand that when Jesus is inviting these people to be his disciples, to be his followers, he really introduces them to a radical way of being, a radical way of thinking. He talks about our relationships, how we deal with the enemies, how we deal with the world, how we deal with one another. You know, when he said, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are you when you're persecuted for being righteous. I mean, he really talks about how we live. So, two aspects of the sermon. One is relationally, who are you? And if you're a follower of Jesus, a child of God, you are his. Second point, how are you going to treat the people around you? So Jesus really lays out this identity piece, what it means to be his, salt and light, blessed, and then how are you going to treat the people around you? And so as John talked last week about anger, and I mean, if you didn't hear that, go back and go to the website and listen to that sermon on anger. I mean, it really spoke to a lot of us. And so with our anger, we have an opportunity to be a witness for Christ and how we demonstrate it and how we control that. So we're going to spend some time this morning, but I'm going to read the text, and then I think John's got something he's going to be doing while I'm reading the text. So Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 27. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But Jesus says, but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one member of your perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. For I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason, except sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Jesus is really inviting us into this radical way of being. And what we really wanted to do is let this text this morning sit in the Sermon on the Mount. Because I think that most clearly helps us to understand what Jesus' point is. That this radical way of being, when Jesus calls his disciples into a life of following him, he sanctifies, if you will, their entire life. It has now been set apart. You've been called from one world into another world. And living in his kingdom means it becomes a priority for you in your life.
Why did you get married? You probably, at least you hopefully, loved each other, right? You started dating. You got to know each other. You developed a strong amount of affection in your heart for the other party. And then you pop the question, guys, right? Or maybe gals, right? It is the 21st century. Why'd you get married? Where's Josiah? Hey, Josiah, come up here for a minute. Maisie, will you come here? We're going to have a shotgun wedding. Josiah, you stand right here. Turn around. See how embarrassed he is. He's mine, so I can do this. See how embarrassed he is. How old are you, Josiah? 6. Maisie, how old are you? 9. So she's the older woman, right? You excited about that? Now, Jerry, let me ask you a question. I have decided that furtherance of my own family and the stake that we have in this community, that to welcome Maisie into our family would be the best thing. But I don't want to do it today. I'm going to do it in 10 years. What do I owe you? We'll talk about it later. That's an arranged marriage, right? It's not that we're going to marry these two today so you can take a breath, Josiah. It's that we've decided that in 10 years, our children are going to be married because there's some political advantage, because there's some economical advantage, because there's an advantage. And so I've decided that I'm going to ask the father for his daughter's hand 10 years from now. That's an arranged marriage. And that is what the vast majority of marriages were in the first century. In that part of the world at that time, that's how people got married. Can you imagine if we did that today? Can you imagine if in America we lived with the principles of arranged marriages, where daddy chose who his son was going to marry 10, 15, or 20 years before the wedding actually occurred? So the reason that we get married today is because we like each other, and then because we develop affection for each other, and then because we love each other, because we get along, because we're a great balance. None of that existed in the first century. It wasn't a part of why folks got married, because they were just going to be married all of their lives. And you can imagine how awkward it would be for 9-year-olds to know in 10 years we're getting married, but we have to be friends right now. There wasn't this cultivation of relationships in the first century the way there is now, which makes what Jesus says fascinating. Because Jesus says, for a marriage to dissolve, the only reason is adultery. And he's talking to people who didn't have the ability to know if they liked each other before they got married. And what does that say about American culture in regard to marriage? You see, for Jesus, it's far more than just your being happy. I think Jesus wants us to be happy. There's nothing wrong with happiness. Nothing wrong with it at all. But when happiness becomes our God, and happiness becomes the reason that marriages exist or don't exist, we miss the root of what Jesus says. Because for Jesus, the root is your identity. The root is, who are you going to be? Are you going to keep your oath? Are you going to seek higher things from the Lord? Or are you going to seek what you want?
When we began reading the text a few minutes ago, Jesus talked about lust in relation between lust and adultery. And when you begin looking at what he says, it's pretty profound. He says, now, if you lust, you commit adultery in your heart. In other words, if you have your thing on anything other than him, and you let anything get in the way of your relationship with him, you're really changing what you've been called to be. And he makes this really profound statement, and some people are literally taking it literally. Some people understand it being hyperbole, that Jesus is making an exaggeration. But he says, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your hand offends you, cut it off. But then he follows it right back up with this statement about marriage, about relationships, about this covenant we make. And Jesus says, this is essentially very important for you to understand. As my disciple, we're making something very sacred now. Making something very important now. We're not going to define it as other people define it. Jesus says what holds people together in this relationship is that it's so sacred that to divide it up commits fundamental sin. Now, John and I made a conscious decision to keep this comments that Jesus made in Matthew chapter 5. We're not going to follow the other text that he talks about, but looking specifically at Matthew chapter 5, in the context of this new way of living, this new way of being, this new way of relating, Jesus says your personal relationships matter. What are you pursuing? What are you looking for? Am I going to be it? Will a relationship with me be enough? Or are you going to let your eyes wonder or your hearts wonder, will I be enough? This radical way of being relates to something very important in how we connect to each other. We are in a cultural warfare. The world is trying to redefine everything. And it's time for the kingdom to take her proper place in this world and speak the truth regarding what God's plan is for how we relate to each other, how we make relationships with one another, and how we connect to one another. And Jesus chose in this point to go from talking about adultery to basically and the importance of maintaining our promises that we make as His people to one another. Jesus connects these two things, divorce and adultery. And more or less like adultery, Jesus says, divorce says, as long as you are occupied with your own needs, your spouse is just some object, not a person to be loved. When Paul chose to make comments regarding the relationship between Christ and the church, what relationship did he choose? Husband and wife. There's something very unique about this relationship. It was the one thing that Adam and Eve got to take with them from the Garden of Eden, that relationship. And Jesus really brings this as an emphasis in this sermon about discipleship. Now, He's not commanding His disciples to go out and get married. That's not what He's saying here. But if they are, you make it count. You make it matter.
There's this movie that came out, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, where the movie relates this story between this man and this woman who are trying to get together, trying to love each other, trying to work through their issues, not really sure about what's coming up. And the scene where Tom Cruise walks into the room and there's a Why We Hate Men meeting going on. And Tom Cruise walks in and he looks at his woman and he says, "You complete me." And every woman in America sighed. And every man in America threw up in their mouth, right? And for once, I think, heaven agrees with the men.
Yeah.
Because it is a lie that it is anybody else's job to complete you.
Amen.
To put that kind of pressure on somebody to do what only God can do will set us up for relational failure. The cycle that we see over and over and over again in our country, again, a country where we choose who we marry, is you don't complete me, I'm not happy, that makes me angry, so I'm going to look for something better. And Jesus says this is a living, breathing parable. What would happen spiritually to us if Jesus decided to love us only when we completed Him? What would happen if God's love for us was contingent upon us making Him happy? And what Jesus says, what Paul says, what all the New Testament writers that deal with this topic say is that what you do as a man and a woman, what you do as a husband and a wife is a living parable for the world to see. That when folks look at the way that you relate to your wife, when people look at the way that you relate to your husband, they see Jesus. Or they don't. And based on them seeing Jesus through your marriage, how clear of a picture are you painting? Do they see Him or not?
I guess to our young people, we need to maybe owe you an apology. That we don't always emphasize some principles that we probably should more of. Things like sexual purity. That Jesus is really talking about, and making good choices about what you do with your eyes and your bodies and your hands and glorifying God. But that lesson also applies to us all. But also maybe not being real honest to you about how hard marriage is. It's hard. It's hard work. If you don't like work, don't get married. Amen? To make it work, you must work it. And it's not about always getting your own needs met. And the reality of it is, there are make or break points in every marriage and relationship. People begin pretty much in fantasy about what marriage is going to be like. And then there's a disillusionment that takes place. And you go through the desert of disillusionment. But if you remain faithful, you come out on the other side of the promised land. But it happens. And about time you get used to expect one thing, guess what? Things change. You have kids, and that's not always fun because they have a lot of demands. A few years ago, researchers, they charted marital happiness. People start out pretty high, then they have kids and it goes pretty low. Okay? Then their kids get big enough to take care of themselves and it begins to go back up again. Then they get teenagers and it goes real low again. Real low when you have teenagers. Okay? But then people who hang together and make it through that, they begin upward trend. And for many couples, they're happier later in years than they were the first year they got married. That's the potential that people have. When people are committed to God and to one another, He can do that. But it is hard. We got together the other night, and Ray and Pat will be married 60 years this year, right? And Ray said, in the words of wisdom, talking to some young guys, says, it's been hard some of those years. And anybody's been married any time at all, if you've dirtied up all the towels you got for your showers, okay, you've been married a little while, okay, you realize it's not always easy. But part of what we understand as Christians when we're caught in this relationship, we can't use the world standards for marriage, right? Let me ask you this question. Is Jesus Lord? Pretty weak response on that. Is Jesus Lord?
Yes.
Is He Lord of all? Does that include marriage? So when we commit ourselves to Christ, we make a big commitment. And so when Paul said in Colossians chapter 3, set your mind on things above, not on things of this earth, for you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also appear with Him in glory. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that we've heard his reference before, he said, when Jesus calls a person, He bids them come and die. We're raising a generation that's very me-oriented, and me doesn't work really good with marriage. It really doesn't. And while we were trying to be real sensitive and letting this text sit with the text and not go too far out and not be prescriptive and tell people what they should or must do, the reality of it is that God's a forgiving God, right? But if I believe I can do whatever I want because God can forgive me, I'm treating God like an idol. He's idolatry. He's not God. Jesus isn't Lord of my life. If I can do whatever I want and just not know I can ask forgiveness for it, that's not really being a disciple. That's using God as an idol, transforming what I want and saying, well, God will forgive me, so I can do what I want. I once talked to a man, he was a Christian man, and he'd been married for a number of years, and he left his wife of a number of years. And, of course, the family was devastated, came to talk to me, and pretty much let me know that his marriage was over. They had fallen in love with somebody else. And he says, I just feel in my heart this is who God wanted me to be with. This is my soulmate. I connect to her like I've never connected to my wife. And I said, but what about God? Well, I intend to serve God in the future. So what you're telling me is that you want God to turn His back long enough on you to let you get what you want, and then you're going to turn your back to God again and do His will. He said, well, I don't want it to sound that way. And I said, well, it sort of sounds like the proposal you're making to me, that you're going to want God to sort of let you do what you want to do. When you get what you want, you're going to honor Him again. That's using God in an idolatrous way, twisting things to make God work for you.
I think as long as we're apologizing, there's a lot of people who divorce has touched that the church hasn't been kind to. Do you know what I mean? And while Jesus gives this idea of a living ethic and of an identity, we also, Mark and I both, understand very, very fully, in as much as we have the ability to, that divorce is a reality, especially in a culture like we live in. And so the church has to combat two different avenues all simultaneously, and sometimes, honestly, we failed at that. We have to combat the idea that says, I'm going to get what I want. I'm going to be all about me. If you don't fulfill me, if you don't complete me, then I'm out. And we know that that's not what Jesus is advocating or saying. But we also have to combat the radical thoughts that even in the areas in which we failed, that the good news of the gospel can't touch those places. And what I want you to know is I've walked this path when I was little. I come from a home where divorce was present. And that has definitely shaped my own identity, and that shaped my own view of the world and of the church. The church, the kingdom, the way of Jesus, at least in this place, wants to preach hope to every person, regardless of where you are. Because we believe that the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ touches the hearts of everyone, regardless of where you are. And so we take the words of Jesus seriously. We don't wink at them. We don't just salute them and say, oh, well, you can still do whatever you want. No, we uphold the standard of what Jesus is saying. But we want you to know, as you look back over the history of your own life, even in those areas where maybe you haven't been as faithful as you could have been, the gospel's for you. And in true repentance, the gospel's for you. The good news of Jesus is for you. Now, as we move forward as a community, as we move forward as a people, what would the world see if they saw in us a people who have a quest, a people who have a desire, a people who have a rock-solid conviction that our identity and our way of living and the ethics in which we used to live by are more important even than our need to be happy? What if we woke up and we said, more important than my desire to be happy is my desire to keep my oath before the Lord? More important than the way I feel today is my desire to show people in the world a living parable of Jesus through my marriage. What if that was the way we lived?
Recently, a couple that I had premarital counseling with about 3 years ago, I think, they made an appointment, and I was happy to see them for counseling. And they came in and they present their issue, and then they were just a funny couple. They had a good sense of humor. And I could tell why they were acting. They'd already resolved the issue they came in for. So we talked about it, and I said, but guys, I said, you're consistent to who I've always known you to be. You talk about it, serious things and open with each other and honest with each other. And you've already resolved this issue before you came here. Why did you come see me? I said, I don't see any reason for y'all being counseling. I mean, you use your strengths and you resolved your issue. And they says, well, we got scared. And I said, what do you mean we got scared? And they said, 4 couples from our church are divorcing now. And these are the couples that we thought we wanted to be like. We wanted to emulate them. And it scared us. That we didn't know, maybe there was something that we weren't aware of that we needed to deal with so we don't wind up there. And I said, well, I appreciate the fact that you're having these conversations and doing this means you're probably not going to be one of those couples. But one of the things that makes this couple very unique is they both individually take their commitment to Jesus very serious. They did that before they got together, and they've done that since they've been together. And so this little diagram here is a really good analogy for what marriages look like in the kingdom. So if you think of it, there's 3 things: man, woman, and God. Right? When we have a marriage, don't we invoke God's name into it? And now pronounce for our eyes is God. And so man, woman, and God. Most people want to work on their relationship on this continuum. Okay, I'm going to get really close to this person. I'm going to know everything there is about them. I'm going to really love them. Everything's going to be wonderful. Okay, so they do a whole lot of this. And sometimes it seems like oneness, doesn't it? We're just connecting. We got the same mind. We complete each other's sentences. We're just perfect together. And sometimes it looks like you're one. But this is hard to maintain. Not that it's going to happen to one of y'all, but one of you men may go home, or a man may go home tomorrow and say to his wife, "Hon, what's for supper?" To which she says, "What do you mean, what's for supper? I've had a hard day. I have to cook. Every day I have to think, what do you mean what's for supper? You can't believe the day I had it. And you ask me what's for supper? And he gets his feelings hurt. He gets sensitive. So where does he go? He goes back to his neutral corner. Okay? Now he's over here pugged, and she's over there pugged. Okay? But she begins feeling bad. Well, I took it out on him. I shouldn't treat him badly and stuff like that. So she tries to go make amends, and she comes back to him, honey, I'm sorry. Well, forget it. I'll have a peanut butter sandwich. Now, if that's ever been anything in your house, okay, you know what I'm talking about. So this is hard to obtain oneness with, right? Too many factors. But if each one of these people individually pursue their discipleship relationship with Jesus Christ and with God, what happens at the distance between them? What happens? Smaller, smaller, smaller. And eventually they can have a union in which they are one with God and one another, and they are blessed. But now, this is a warning. Both of them have to be in pursuit of that relationship. Because if he moves and she doesn't, what happens to the relationship? If he begins pursuing a close relationship with God and she sticks in her neutral corner, what happens? They're getting closer? That's why Paul cautions about being unequally yoked. It's tough. It's tough. So the challenge we have in looking at this is looking at marriage from heaven's perspective. I mean, I'm telling you what, they're calling everything in the world out there marriage now. Aren't they? You can marry a stump and be married, I guess, now in some states. You can't tell people they love. Well, you love a stump, you can go get married to a stump, I guess. But that's not marriage from heaven's perspective, is it? I don't care what they call it, it's not marriage from heaven's perspective. And as kingdom people, we need to look at marriage from heaven's perspective and fight to maintain it in our own lives and within the kingdom. Let it have its place of preeminence. As John says, the living parable.
What parable are you telling? What story are you telling? The thing that I appreciate about Mark and about the leadership here, and specifically a lesson like this, is, and as we talked, we knew this text was coming. And as a subpoint, one of the things about doing a series like the Sermon on the Mount is it forces you to talk about things that you don't want to normally talk about. I didn't wake up today saying, you know what, Lord, I want to preach a sermon about divorce. And neither did Mark. But it's in the text. And so we have to deal with it. And the thing that I appreciate about what we've tried to do, maybe imperfectly, but what I hope that you appreciate about it is we've not offered you a lot of solutions. Jesus says what he says, and we want to just say what he said and let that hit you, however that hits you. But we also want you to feel hope. Marriage is hard, and Jesus has something to say in terms of help for marriage. If you've experienced broken relationships in the past, there's hope. Because Jesus has something to say in terms of help for broken relationships. Guilty or innocent, Jesus has something to say. Maybe you're walking through a season right now, today, where you just feel convicted about what Jesus has said. There's hope. And maybe you feel weird right now. You feel awkward. You feel in your heart like you've got like a frog in your throat. That's the devil. Listen to the hope that Jesus offers. This is a place of peace, not a place of judgment. And we promise to tell you what Jesus says, to love on you, to encourage you, to surround you in prayer. Maybe you're not a believer. Today's a perfect opportunity to do that, to join the perfect marriage of the church and the Lamb. You can be baptized this morning. Well, we'd love to help you do anything we can help you do. All together we stand while we sing.